Happy Easter, and thank you all for joining again. My name is Alexander O'Hara. I'm the National Director for Catechetics for the Irish Episcopal Conference. On behalf of the Council for Catechetics and Veritas, you are most welcome to the third webinar in this series, Together Along the Way, Conversations on Catholic Faith Formation in Contemporary Ireland. This webinar series, organised on behalf of the Council for Catechetics and Veritas, aims to bring together leading theologians, religious educators, and catechists to explore new avenues for Catholic faith formation in contemporary Ireland, inspired by the new Directory for Catechesis, published by the Pontifical Council for Promoting New Evangelization in 2020. In the large, diverse, and complex religious education landscape, directories for catechesis function as atlases that guide educators and faith communities. But we need leaders and visionaries who help us to interpret those atlases and read the maps they contain. In the run-up to the National Synod in Ireland, we hope that this webinar series will animate and inspire religious educators, teachers, pastoral leaders, evangelizers, and anyone else interested in sharing the best of the Catholic tradition with creativity and conviction. And just to know that this is a public forum and we will be recording this webinar. And I should also mention that all of the webinars will be recorded and will be put up on the Veritas YouTube account and also in time on the Catechetics website for the Irish Episcopal Conference. I'm honoured to welcome our third speaker in the series, Dr. Timothy P. O'Malley. Dr. O'Malley is Director of Education at the McGrath Institute for Church Life and Academic Director of the Notre Dame Center for Liturgy. He teaches and researches at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, liturgical sacramental theology, catechesis, and marriage and family. Dr. O'Malley is the author of 7 books, most recently Becoming Eucharistic People, The Hope and Promise of Parish Life, published by Ave Maria Press this year. And he's involved in a variety of initiatives out of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, including the Eucharistic Revival, as well as serving as a consultant for the Committee on Laity, Marriage, Family, Life, and Youth. He's married to Cara and has 2 children, ages 9 and 5. Timothy will speak to us this evening on slow catechesis, contemplative education in late modernity. There's going to be time for Q&A and discussion. We might begin with the Synod prayer. So in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. We stand before you, Holy Spirit, as we gather together in your name. With you alone to guide us, make yourself at home in our hearts. Teach us the way we must go and how we are to pursue it. We are weak and sinful. Do not let us promote disorder. Do not let ignorance lead us down the wrong path, nor partiality influence our actions. Let us find in you our unity so that we may journey together to eternal life and not stray from the way of truth and what is right. All this we ask of you, who are at work in every place and time, in the communion of the Father and the Son, forever and ever. Dr. O'Malley, you're very welcome.
Thanks, Alexander, and it's nice to be here among some friends and people I haven't met before, who will be my friend, I assume, at the end, or enemy. It's up to you. So, well, it's a joy to be here with you and to speak a little on a chapter I wrote in a book that is the part of the inspiration for this webinar, but it's that title of that was Slow Catechesis and Contemplative Education and Late Modernity. And I just want to provide some thoughts to us today about how to approach catechesis in our context today. I once was in a major diocese in the archdiocese in the United States and was meeting with their religious education department. This would be religious education, primarily accomplished at a parish rather than school-based level. And one of the things that was said to me while I was there was that if we could only get the same technology that exists in the schools, then religious education would flourish in this particular archdiocese, right? If there were iPads like there were within the schools, then children would come to sort of a better appreciation of of Catholicism. They would receive the religious education that was hoped for. And and part of it was that things needed to be updated, made more up to date than what they used to be. I contrast this with an experience I had when I visited Rome some years ago on the Feast of Pentecost. There were no iPads, but we attended the Pantheon, where on Pentecost, thousands of rose petals are dropped from above into the space. There was really, there is technology insofar as a building has a certain technology, but there was a kind of distinctive proposal that was given. What was really operative wasn't just speed, but this occasion of beauty, something that made you wonder and take a step back and look at what was available to see. So what I'd like to talk about today is our danger of assuming efficiency and speed, particularly for the late modern person, in fact, may actually hinder us in proposing religious practice, for proposing religious education today in our own context. One of the things that I found in the context of my own catechetical experience in the United States, and I should say, I grew up in a parish-based system. I didn't attend schools, though I did operate out of textbooks that were dependent upon a school-based model, is that there was a kind of expected immediacy and rationality of catechesis. At the end of every sort of moment or lesson, what do you take away? How is your life going to be different? What do you think about X doctrine or Y practice? If you're me, those are questions that took a little bit more time to figure out the answer to. You didn't immediately know the answer. And in fact, you couldn't answer right away without knowing. I suppose it's something about being partially a mild introvert, is that when someone asks a question like this right away, it might take me, several months to figure out what the answer could be, right? Rather than assuming, well, then I know what I think, how my life is going to be different because of this new thing that I was proposed. And so one of the things I want to make as an argument, especially for those of us who live in what I would call late modernity, this is post-modernity, I suppose, in some sense, but I prefer the term late modernity because it's just a hyper sort of sense of the modern age. And the problem in late modernity is that actually speed and efficiency is everything, and it actually hindered us from the contemplative act. It hinders us from the searching for meaning. I have a book that I really like called The Uncontrollability of the World by Hartmut Rosa, a German sociologist. And he notes that modern society, as I define it, is one that can stabilize itself only dynamically. In other words, one that requires constant economic growth, technological acceleration, and cultural innovation in order to maintain its institutional status quo. In other words, a modern society is defined by speed, growth, change. You have to make decisions quicker, more quickly. In a classroom setting, at the worst, this becomes then things need to change within such a setting every 7 minutes if you are to keep the attention of a 8th grader, someone in the United States that we call 8th grade. But this also means that there's a kind of anxiety accompanying it. I teach primarily undergraduates at the University of Notre Dame, and I've never encountered a more anxious group of people. They don't know how to exist, to be, except from moving to the next thing, to further growth, to further acceleration. That is, our life will be better if we manage to bring more world within our reach, if we have more and more control over things, if speed moves along. This is something that another philosopher, Byung-Chul Han, in his Disappearance of Rituals, refers to as a sort of loss of ritual, because all that we know is speed. We become addicted for work. So as forms of play, festivals are self-representations of life. They're characterized by excess, an expression of our overflowing life that does not aim at a goal. In the festival, life relates to itself instead of subordinating itself to external purposes. Time that's completely dominated by the compulsion of production. The sort of time we inhabit today is a time without festival. Life becomes impoverished. It freezes into mere survival. Everything becomes the workaday world. There's yet one more thing to accomplish on top of all the other things that must be accomplished. And there is no time for space, for relaxation. I certainly have seen this over the course of 20 years in the United States, in which there's a near total disappearance of time off. I mean, I give this as a kind of strange example, but once upon a time, there were certain days that stores would close. Things like Thanksgiving in the United States in November, or Christmas. And even those dates are now sort of changing. Christmas remains a time of some closure, but Thanksgiving, things must open up because production must continue. Time must move along, and time is money, right? And so there is no festival, and yet there's this need for festivity today. So what I want to think a little bit about is a claim then, therefore, in the Directory for Catechesis, the new one, that speaks of not only what there is to teach, but a certain mode or festive way of proposing to someone what it means to worship. And in fact, this is really, I would say, integral to the whole task of the various tasks of catechesis, assuming of a certain disposition. The Directory claims catechesis educates the believer in the attitudes that the Church's celebrations require: joy for the festive quality of celebrations, a sense of community, attentive listening to the Word of God, confident prayer, praise, and thanksgiving, awareness of symbol and signs. Through conscious and active participation in the celebrations, catechesis teaches the believer to understand the liturgical year, the true teacher of the faith, and the significance of Sunday, the day of the Lord and of the Christian community. Catechesis also aids in the appreciation of the expressions of faith found in popular piety. In the previous directory, the 1997 one, it referred to it hinted at these dispositions, but here you have a full expression of them in the 2021 directory, and particularly, I should say, underlining, or rather the 2020 directory, underlining that there should be festive joy, community, that there's a way of life, what the 97 directory referred to as a liturgical way of life. Liturgy, popular piety, and beauty propose to us a way of life marked by festivity, by community, by a certain contemplative disposition that looks at the signs and wonders in love and gratitude. This is what I suspect the Italian catechist Sofia Cavalletti meant in her Religious Potential of the Child, when she talked about a pedagogy of signs as marking all catechesis. Of course, we're speaking here about her work in Catechesis of the Good Shepherd. She notes that this pedagogy of signs and instructions is a method conscious of its limits, and as such, it's filled with veneration for the mystery, which it knows to be unfathomable. It doesn't ask for immediate explanation. It enters one into a world where one first learns to behold, to wonder, to acknowledge of what's going on before a decision is made. It's a method that does not claim to explain, circumscribe, or define, at least too quickly, but rather one that speaks through hints, right? The instructor, as like in all Montessori education, doesn't immediately tell you what's going on, but sets up an environment for an encounter. The method of signs knows that human language is always an approximation. At the same time, it's a method full of respect for the person and their capacities. In contradistinction to defining something, the sign creates space for the individual's personal work of absorption. I want to give an example here that I think can concretize what I'm speaking about when I think about a slow catechesis, something that operates according to a pedagogy of signs that forms for dispositions rather than immediately sort of asking our reaction. It creates a milieu or an environment for the possibility of encounter. In the year 2019, I believe, or 2017, sorry, I was in Belgium when I found out my grandmother was to have the stroke that would end her life. And, you know, I'm very far away from her, there for a conference. And the group was going on a field trip the next day, and I just couldn't be with anyone. So I went off by myself to visit an altarpiece in Ghent that I wanted to visit for years. Obviously, it's the altarpiece before you, the Ghent altarpiece. And as I entered the chapel in the space, I noticed in a particular kind of way, first of all, everyone was visiting it initially in the kind of way that you visit art museums sometimes, right? They're really there to see it as famous. And at the time, the altarpiece was closed. It was not opened. And so on the front, you could see only the scene of the Annunciation with various figures around it. And we were there as its opening, and suddenly the whole room was filled with a kind of silence as they beheld this image of the saints, of the heavenly liturgy, of at the center Christ being crucified, or the Lamb, I should say, sort of Lamb once slain, as an image of the kind of Eucharist. And this was a very poignant moment for me, right? There was no way to figure out how I would respond to this in my current state, right? In the sort of life existence, the exigencies that I was undergoing. And yet this encounter was profoundly religious and formative for me. It helped me to see this image in a new way, right? Recognizing the mortality of my grandmother, linked very closely to the sacrificial love of the Lamb once slain, wounded upon the altar, and yet the angels and the saints coming together. It took time for me to reflect on the movement of this experience. It was not immediate, and I needed the time to do so, right? I needed this time of silence, of contemplative wonder to respond. This is what I mean by slow catechesis, operating by a pedagogy of signs that sets up a kind of invitation to wonder, to ponder, and they sometimes even change the way that one lives in light of this. So I'd like to conclude today, before I open up for the option for conversation around some of what I'm proposing, is that if we live in this age of total speed, and we have to slow down in catechesis, in fact, probably think about our work less in catechesis and religious education, less as offering, and I speak about this, I should say, in the United States context, where there are fewer sort of national level requirements than there may be in Ireland. So I look forward to the conversation that we have. But I find that slowing down is integral to the act of education, particularly for the late modern person who's inundated with speed, and that one of the first tasks is to seek wonder. So as Alexander said at the beginning, I'm involved in this Eucharistic formation that's going on in the US Church. So I'm thinking a lot about Eucharistic catechesis. So I'd like to take us through sort of several of these moments of religious education. You'll notice that each are surrounded by kind of a moment of poetry or artistry, and a moment of a chance to contemplate what is given and beheld in this tradition that we seek to pass on within the sort of catechetical setting. But the first moment is a kind of moment of beholding or wonder. I find that the first task for the late modern person is to actually invite them just to look, to slow down and gaze. It's not to propose what they've always perceived to be the case, but actually to take a step back and look anew, to elicit wonder, to engage in this act of beholding. I have before you an image of one of my favorite Marian's images. It's the Madonna fire screen. It's a Eucharistic devotional piece of art. And like a lot of people who encounter art, one of our dangers when we encounter art is that, you try to sort of simply determine what's there. Well, first of all, you determine if it's famous and if it's worth beholding in the first place. I remember once when I was in France and went to the Louvre to see the Mona Lisa, everybody was just running to the Mona Lisa just to take a picture in front of it, never actually encountering what there was to behold. So actually the first step of art is to stop and look. And what do you behold when you look closely at this image? Of course, you see Mary, right? Probably, if you can recognize it. You see the child Jesus. But there's much more to behold if you attend to it. And in fact, it's a very strange image. You can see behind Mary, the reason why it's called a fire screen is that her own halo is actually the screen of a fire. And if it was the full image on display, you would see the fire emerging from the fire screen. You see Mary draped in this extraordinarily large white garment, folded around her. And yet on her lap is a child, Jesus, on a piece of white cloth himself, a kind of corporal. To Mary's left, you find a strange chalice, a cup of sorts, on a kind of table. And then you look behind Mary and you notice the book blowing in the wind. Of course, if you know much about art history, this is often one of the signs that the Spirit is present blowing the book. But if you look very closely at the book, it's a Roman missal. It's a Eucharistic image. And of course, it's on a red pillow linked to sort of green, almost a kind of liturgical setting. Mary's floor, almost like the floor of a church. This likely, the Madonna fire screen, was a Eucharistic devotional space held in a Dominican's sort of private space for the sake of contemplation. Once you look closely, you see how strange the whole thing is. And I should say, I don't recommend using this image with, 8th grade, 9th grade, 12-year-old, 13, 14-year-old children. It elicits something quite different than intended. But for a more mature audience, you see the strangeness of the way that Mary's breast is actually held to the Christ child. When they analyze the image, they notice that originally Jesus's full sort of male member was on display, his genitalia, and they were wounded. It was a recollection of the feast of the circumcision of Jesus, in which he first shed his blood for the human family that he came to redeem. And so this is really a sort of image of the Eucharistic mystery of love, something wondrous to behold, but not presented in the mode of a definition, but in the mode of signs. And Mary, of course, offers her breast to Christ, breast milk being originally understood in the medieval period, late medieval period even, as a kind of palatable blood that was fed to the child. And so the Christ child feeds on the very blood of the human family, while Mary offers this blood to us, right, as the Christ child is offered. Now, I'm not saying that this needs to be explained, but this kind of artistry elicits wonder, awakens people to something more to behold. It requires time to slow down, even to attend what's in the image rather than to move as quickly as possible. This kind of use of imagery is necessary if we're to serve as a medicine against the hyper-speed culture, the anti-festivity that tends to operate in late modernity. So a task has to be to invite people to behold, to elicit this kind of wonder. And yet this wonder occurs with questions and dialogue. It requires time and space to make sense of these signs. Again, focusing around the Eucharist, where I spend a lot of my time, how does one think about something like the doctrine of transubstantiation, right? In which the substance of bread and wine become fully the body and blood of Christ, and these species or accidents remain given so that it can feed us. Since this group is fairly well known, is a theologically sophisticated group, I don't need to explain this doctrine. But what I will acknowledge is the following, is that this doctrine then isn't just a doctrine that's explanatory. I sometimes think we think pondering a doctrine is some sort of act of punishment for people. But actually, pondering a doctrine can take time. It's not simply that the doctrine can be repeated back, but it offers something for our lives. In his own poem on the Eucharist, Thomas Aquinas, on the sequence for the Feast of Corpus Christi, Lauda Zion, knows that the dogma is given to Christians that bread is changed into flesh and wine into blood. What you do not understand nor see, a strong faith makes firm beyond the order of things, under diverse species. Signs alone and not things hide remarkable realities. Flesh is food, blood is drink. Nevertheless, the whole Christ remains under each species. If we think about catechesis simply as getting people to understand the doctrine of transubstantiation, the whole thing can be accomplished rather quickly. But the task is actually to ponder it, to let it unfold what's happening in the context of our lives, to see what is happening, to see the doctrine as proposing something very good and worthwhile. I think about this in two ways right now. First, I think after COVID, or in the midst of COVID, depending upon where we are, many of us have struggled with discerning the presence of where God is in the midst of so many things that have gone wrong in the context of our lives. Death, sometimes, suffering, sorrow, things canceled. And at the heart of the Christian mystery of love is a doctrine of the hiddenness of God, right? Known, given to us in a way that we can receive it, but known in such a way that it's not immediately evident to the senses, right? After all, what's really being proposed is what you do not understand nor see. A strong faith makes firm. Or another way of saying this is, if you think about it like this, that what the sense, or where senses fail, faith alone suffices. Where the senses fail, there's love made present, and the task is to let people behold the presence of this love, often hidden. It does take time. And this is what the Eucharist proposes. And it offers the freedom to offer that gift of the self back in return. This is often something that takes a long amount of time to discern. The Catholic, or the almost Catholic, I should say, philosopher, she was Jewish but became almost Catholic, Simone Weil, referred to the Eucharistic Mystery as the great act of freedom. God came in a way that looked totally ordinary to us, the most ordinary space of bread, so that the human person could have the freedom to respond in love. So to ponder this doctrine, therefore, is actually to chew on the mystery of love made flesh and given to us. It's not something that can be moved upon quickly. There has to be a basic understanding, but there has to be the meditation, the pondering, the asking questions from the doctrine to the context of our lives, of our existence, of what it means to live and behold the mystery of love that is life itself. Lastly, a lot of this relates to practice. I think one of the things that Catholicism proposes to the human person is that you don't immediately grasp the mystery of love right away, that it takes a life of practice, of enfleshing Catholicism by going to Mass, living out this mystery of love. Sometimes my undergraduates say to me, Tim, I don't get much out of Mass. And I say, well, first off, I say, well, me too sometimes. But secondarily, I say to them, a far more important thing. I acknowledge that often this sort of mystery of love, God comes in these times, not when you expect it, but in the slow waiting of that regular practice of attending the Eucharistic liturgy regularly, of enfleshing and practicing Catholicism. So in conclusion, friends, I simply acknowledge that one of the things we need in late modernity is not so much speed, not more and more shoved into a smaller space. We actually need to slow down. We need to recognize that if Pope Francis speaks about apprenticeship, as he speaks about accompaniment, an encounter, that the task of religious education may need to become an occasion of forming people, particularly religious people, in dispositions that prepare them to make this encounter, to slow down and to take up a festive disposition. Less is more, and the dimensions of popular piety, of art, and of the liturgy are really quite essential for this kind of dispositional formation today. All right, so that's all I have. I wanted to not surpass the 25-minute range for our conversation. So I'm open to any insights from the presentation, questions, if we just want to dialogue together as a group, and maybe something that you learned or thought about that could be integrated into your work. I'd love to get to know you a bit better. And that's all I have. So I'll unshare these slides. Oh, well, I'll keep it here for now while the questions are going. And then maybe in about 2 minutes, I'll unshare the slides so that we can have a period of conversation. And I'm so glad to be here. Thanks, Alexander.
Thank you so much, Tim, for that wonderfully thoughtful presentation and much needed. You just had two things that struck me was, first of all, really, I recalled kind of John Senior and his kind of thing in the 70s, I think it was, in the University of Kansas, where in a way he realized with his students that he had to get them to engage with the real world again, and in terms of wonder. So in terms of, say, there was kind of stargazing classes, and that he realized it was to get them out of their heads and to re-engage with reality, essentially. And then which was incredibly effective. And another thing that struck me about your slow catechesis, I was thinking about Nir Eyal and his hooked model, particularly if you think about how Silicon Valley engineers social media products to be addictive, essentially, and they use psychological ways to do that. But this thing called a hook model, which is a real 4-stage process, and we can think, for all of us who use WhatsApp and Facebook, things like that, you will recognize this, that there's a model here. It's a trigger, action, and then reward. You get the dopamine hit, and then that leads to investment. So kind of a four stage model. And in a sense, what you're proposing is maybe turning that model, reverse engineering that model with beholding, pondering, infleshing. And I suppose the challenge is living in our speed addictive culture, is how do we kind of create environments that reverse engineer and I think that the example that you gave in terms of the Catechesis of the Good Shepherd and the Montessori setting is a really good example of that. But there were just two thoughts that were triggered in your presentation. If you can maybe stop sharing now, we can just open it to is there any other comments or discussions.
Leonardo had the hand up.
Hello, yes, it was me. Thank you. I'm just calling from across the channel from just outside Glasgow, so I'm closer to Ireland than Tim is. I thought when I saw the advert he was actually in Dublin, but no, he's still in South Bend. When Tim was going through his presentation, the name of the concept that was going through my mind, name and concept, was Joseph Pieper and Leisure, the Basis of Culture. And a short book, a book which is powerful, and it's one where we will find inspiration, I believe, for all efforts to improve the way we see God, understand God, not understand God, but try to engage in the liturgy. And I love the title Slow Catechesis. This idea of slow food movement in Italy, which is very close to my heart, as you can see from the name, though, the slow nourishment of food and the slow catechetical food. I think these two are areas where we can actually have some synergy. So again, just to add to people's reading list, Joseph Pieper, Leisure, the Basis of Culture, I think is something which we would do well to have on hand. But thank you very much, Tim. I really, really enjoyed that.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Yeah, and that is the basis of, I never actually said that was the basis with the slow food movement, but a lot of this does emerge in the particulars of a U.S. context, where I suspect one of the things we wanted to do in the early 2000s was we felt we were losing people, and so we tried. I love doctrine. I teach it all the time. I should say that I love doctrine. But the response was to try to cram as much doctrine in as to sort of stop the disaffiliation process. And what I've actually found from years of teaching, primarily 18 to 22-year-olds, is less is more. And that it's actually well-coordinated, slow contemplation of a couple of things that matter, rather than trying to do the totality of everything as quickly as possible. And so I think that's the roots of a concern that I have in the U.S. context, which I suspect is not the same everywhere, but since I'm with you, I get to talk about it.
Yeah, hi. Just in the Irish school context, I think there's a couple of issues that where you're teaching at the third level, I would assume where you are, that the people there are willing to learn, wanting to learn, and will come along with you perhaps on the slow process. In the Irish secondary system, which is what I'd be used to, you have, it may be called catechetics or religious education, but you've got people in your class who kind of don't want to be there, maybe even resent being there, and bringing them along on a slow catechesis, might work and might open their minds to certain things, but it certainly is a difficult situation. And then if you teach it as religious education as a kind of an academic subject, then you're in a different environment where I'm not sure is the slow approach going to work, because very often you're working towards a test and an exam, and teachers will feel under pressure to cram in a lot of content. So I suppose it does depend on the context you're working in.
No, it's a good point. Yes, thank you. So I should say that I actually work with a variety of people who despise what I do, or they're very uninterested. If you're teaching, I've been in primarily sort of voluntary secondary settings or undergraduate settings where there's forced theology. And I often am told right away by students that my class, I teach a very large class in the sacrament of marriage and love and family life, that mine is the most palatable of the required courses that they could have chosen, which is why they're in it. It seems least offensive. By the end, and I have figured out how to slow down. If you take time and you wonder and behold yourself, there's a kind of interest that grows. Now, they don't all care, I should say. And in fact, I should say my worst students are those who think that they've received a full Catholic. I assume that in Ireland, this probably is more common, right? You grew up in a family and it was Catholic, or you assume you know what being Catholic means. And so you think like, well, what does Tim have to say that's at all different? And so I actually find it does have some working. As far as the RE setting, it's an interesting one because I suspect in the US, in the school system, and I know I have some colleagues here who do more in US schools, and I'm very happy to have say something, is actually we have put a lot into the curriculum, and I kind of wonder if lots is a winning order. So that's a critique of us. I think more isn't always a winning thing, and we have seemed to sometimes reduce like mastery to knowing as much as possible rather than knowing how to know more on your own, right? When I was getting my doctorate, it wasn't the amount that I knew, it was the dispositions that I had developed that allowed me now to research anything that I had the capacity for. And I wonder if sometimes we, in assembling curricula, assume that more is the winning dimension rather than what is needed to know X, Y, or Z. And I'm somewhat familiar, I should say, with the Irish RE, both primary and secondary sort of curricula and the complications of them. But that's a critique I have of the state. And particularly in the US, we don't have that, but we do operate in primarily a testing culture. And that's why my 18 to 22-year-olds are falling apart because they've felt like they've been tested the totality of their lives and they just can't take it anymore. So I do think that we are calling education to a more authentic vision of what it could be. But I take the content, Brendan, I'm very clear that I understand that this is not a easy thing to offer a critique of.
I think in a way, as you showed with the beautiful Ghent altarpiece, that art is a very effective medium to engage and to lead people in a deeper pondering. Yeah. So, but certainly, yeah, it's the same I would say in Ireland with terms of the point system, particularly for leaving cert, that there's often that idea that, well, RE is a waste of time, or it's what's the point, so it's very much focused on what's going to get me the point. So it's But I suppose, as you said, it provides an opportunity to explore deeper issues. Sister Catherine, if you can unmute, thank you.
Hi, good evening, all. My accent's going to betray me that I'm an American living in Ireland, also with a background in Catechesis of the Good Shepherd. So thanks, Tim, for a previous webinar that I enjoyed through CGS USA that you did. I think my comments come from my experience working with TY students doing Alpha Youth. A few things that I have appreciated about Alpha Youth that I'm connecting here with what Tim has shared. So Alpha Youth is an ecumenical pre-evangelization program that really acknowledges the big questions of life and is very comfortable with not having answers and in allowing everyone, in operating from the stance that everyone has something to say about the big topics of life. I think that leans into this stance of wonder. I think it also shows from the research that Gen Z doesn't really want the church to have answers. So, I'm working mostly with 16-year-olds. They're very comfortable with the church not having answers. They would really appreciate someone being with them. I think that's where the art of encounter, creating a culture of encounter, can lean into this. I'm also thinking of Tim's premise sort of at the start of this was coming from a parish model. And I'm thinking of how maybe in Ireland there can be supplementary, I don't want to say parallel tracks because that's not really the image I want to create, but like flying buttresses. They exist outside of the school system, but they are there to support. And so it's like, do we see the formal catechetics that we give to students in school as being supported by these punctuated wonder moments, perhaps through a parish or through a Youth 2000 or through, other experiences that create a sense of community, remind us that we're part of something bigger than ourselves. I think sitting with questions without needing to have answers, taking ourselves away from a question and answer approach to catechesis, and even the idea we can Google whatever question we have, we can get a Google answer to. This challenges me to be of a different caliber when I'm with youth about the faith. So thanks, Tim, for laying down a bit of a challenge.
Thanks, sister.
Thank you, sister. Yeah, and your comment made me think of, in a way, pilgrimage, and I know more schools now are taking pupils on the Camino de Santiago, and there's also a lot of local pilgrimage routes, resurrected in Ireland. So that's a wonderful way of kind of slowing down, getting into nature, and a perfect kind of way to do slow catechesis as well. Harry, you had a question?
Yeah, first of all, I want to say thanks to Tim for a very thought-provoking and inspirational half hour. Some of what he said might seem to have been very basic, and yet he presented it in a very engaging way. And it's worth reminding ourselves that sometimes we think it all rests on us, but we're just agents, and we need to always remember that fact. And what I got from tonight was the fact that, look, the world is very fast-paced. Our concentration is limited. And it seems that the more we become addicted to the internet and short pieces of, bites of information, the speedier it all gets, and the more unaccustomed we become to just reflecting on things. I thought too of a poem that some of you will be familiar with Joseph Mary Plunkett's poem, I See His Blood Upon the Rose. I'm sitting here in my car, having listened for the last 45 minutes on the way home from work to a very interesting conversation. And I'm now sitting in my driveway, and there's beech trees that have been here for hundreds of years in front of me. And I think of those lines from Joseph Mary Plunkett's poem, I see his blood upon the rose, and in the stars, the glory of his eyes, his body gleams amid eternal snows, his tears fall from the skies. All pathways by his feet are worn, his strong heart stirs the ever-beating sea, his crown of thorns in every thorn, his cross in every tree. Worth remembering a few days after Good Friday and Easter Sunday and the empty tomb. When I used to teach religion, it was back, the last time I taught a class was in 1999. I remember very clearly my final class with Leavencerts, which were, final year of high school for us. And I wondered, was it right to be getting out of it? Had I, had any effect in the 17 years that I was in the classroom and so on? And one of the things that I would think that is important for us again to remember is that God became, a vulnerable child at Bethlehem. And so relationships are absolutely central. So we we become the agents, the transmitters, the people who are in the relay race. We pass on the baton of faith. We fan the flame of faith by our witness and by our accompaniment. How we stand and stare and look, how we even pause, what we can see in the world. When Tim was talking about the fire screen and the mother and child, the Blessed Virgin and the child there, and the infant being nurtured at the breast, I pulled in on the side of the road to look at the image he was talking about, and I thought of Father Jerry Rice, a colleague of mine now dead, on his classes on iconography, and him talking to us about how poetry and literature and drama and history can teach us things, because ultimately we're about relationships. And God became a child in human form, and that child grew and suffered for us and died and rose from the dead. And we have to have that sense of being agents and let God work through us. It doesn't all depend on us. And yet when we find an inspirational speaker like tonight, they do something to us that reminds us of those things. Going back to that last class I taught in 1999, there was a chap in it called Martin. And for 2 years, he had been an absolute thorn in my side. And I felt he was very, very broken. And a few weeks ago, a neighbor of mine died. She was a Down syndrome 36-year-old. And her mother said to me, could you go to the local newspaper, the Meath Chronicle, and could you ask them if they would do a little piece on her? A little piece above the ordinary in the obituary section of the paper, because she was such a special child. And I went into the Meath Chronicle, and I had a mask on me because of COVID. And the chap on the other side of the reception place, he too had a mask on him. And I said, hello, how are you? And he said, Mr. Casey, is it? I said, Martin, how are you? And he said, my God, he said, so many years have passed, and so many times, he said, I wanted to look you up, he said, to say thanks for the 2 years, he said, that I tortured you, but you never gave up on me, he said. He said, I remember going to you to tell you that my mother had cancer. And he said, you sat and you listened, and I was so angry. And in every religion class, he said, my anger came to the surface, and I took it out on you. And he said, do you remember, he said, my last class with you? I said, Martin, I remember it very clearly. And he said, here, I'm putting the sign up on the door, closed for a half an hour. He said, let's go for a coffee. And he took me through how he came to discover God through the death of his mother. So we never know the effect that we can have on people, and how our time in the classroom, whether it be with people who maybe despise what it is we have to teach, or maybe seem to be disinterested because they don't know the richness of it. And yet, I can't imagine a life without the child in the crib at Bethlehem without the cross and Calvary and without the empty tomb. So thanks to all of you who work and labour sometimes in lonely furrows. And I thank God for my mum and dad and my brothers and sisters and the opportunity to teach and to work with beautiful people. And, you know, when you think of Stalin or Lenin or Putin or whoever it is, and you think then of characters like W.B. Yeats or Patrick Kavanagh, the poet, or Gerard Manley Hopkins, that most people would be familiar with on an international level and so on. And you think of the Word, and then you think of people and incarnation. That's what it's all about. So folks, don't give up. There's so much to, so many reasons to live and to love. So thanks to all of you tonight. Thanks.
Any further comments or
Siobhan
questions?
here.
Yeah. Siobhan,
hi. How are you? Thank you very much. It was wonderful. I just a few thoughts. You know, you're just saying earlier, Tim, modern society could be defined in terms of speed. Everything is about speed. And I think the religious education classroom provides a space that's countercultural, that actually is an opportunity to slow down. You know, there's an opportunity for students maybe to encounter mystery, to encounter wonder. I'm just thinking of the prayer room in our school that we've just recently reclaimed because it was used as a classroom for COVID, because every space had to be used. And we've now got that back. And it's just wonderful. I'm the chaplain in the school, and it's still, what is this going to be? And we're just listening what will happen, and students are coming in and they're sort of encountering a sacred space perhaps for the first time. So I think as we slow down, we don't have to have all the answers. The Spirit is alive and things will emerge, you know. And another thing, we were talking about poetry, and our previous speaker talked about poetry, and I'm thinking of Patrick Kavanagh, who said, "Through a chink too wide, there comes in no wonder." So, you know, we have to join all the dots, you know, that we just set the thing up and the Spirit will perhaps will do the rest, you know. So that's and just recently I encountered a young group of people for the synod, and they blew me away with their positivity, you know, that these questions that we were asked were very difficult questions. And young people, first years, fifth years, 12-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 18-year-olds, really were able to engage with them once they were given the opportunity. So there are seeds there. The Spirit is working. So I would still be hopeful for the future, you know. So that's all I have to share.
Thank you very much, Siobhan. Thank you. And thank you all for joining this evening, and to Tim for leading us this evening. Our next speaker in the series will be Professor Thomas Groom from Boston College on Wednesday, the 18th of May at 7 o'clock. The link for registration will be available on the catechetics.ie website in webinars. Just say again that all of our webinars will be recorded and put up on Veritas YouTube account and on the Catechetics website in due course. So just to wish you all again a very happy and blessed Easter season, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Wonderful to be with you, and if you ever in South Bend, come visit.
Thank you.
Thanks a million, Tim. Thank you to all of you. God bless. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.